Are we having a good time? I think so. Should we do it again? Positive feedback, right? That's good. My name, once again, is Patrick Anderson. I'm a second-generation Carthaginian, class of 1985. I also want to recognize my history professor and advisor when I was here, Dr. Tom Noer. He's right back here. And yes, I did read Robin Collingwood when I took the class. So I just have one housekeeping matter. You heard last night that we are co-sponsored by the Lincoln Forum, and we do have some registration forms in the basket with today's program if you want to continue the discussion of Abraham Lincoln in November in Gettysburg. And I highly recommend it. I know some of the forum members are here. November is a great time to be in Gettysburg, and especially right around the Gettysburg Address. It's a lot of fun. So if you're interested, pick up a form. And I think the forum's on the website too, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The brochures are gone, which is a good sign.
Oh, okay.
So the Lincoln Forum, oneword.org is the place.
LincolnForum.org. You can find thelincolnforum.org. You can find the forum, and I hope to see all of you in Gettysburg. So I will once again introduce the president of the college, John Swallow, to introduce our first speaker.
It is a privilege to introduce Jonathan White, and I want to say how privileged all of you are because you're going to get to participate in the entire rest of the symposium. I have tried my absolute best, and you may know that we have homecoming and family weekend coming up, and there are just a few things that I'm going to have to step out for, and I'm bitterly disappointed. You would think that a president could arrange his own schedule, but there are limitations. So congratulations to all of you. Jonathan White is Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where he's taught for many years, and he is quite prolific, as you can see. 13 books authored or edited, co-edited. And I'm particularly impressed that in 2019, the State Council of Higher Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia awarded him their Outstanding Faculty Award, the highest honor the Commonwealth awards any faculty member in the entire Commonwealth. Congratulations, Jonathan. So he will be speaking to us today on In a House Built by Slaves, African American Encounters with Abraham Lincoln. Please welcome Jonathan White.
Well, thank you all for coming out. I've never been to Wisconsin before, and I have to say it's been an incredible experience. I got to see the museum yesterday in town, and Doug gave me a tour. I'm not sure where Doug's sitting, right here. And the college is incredible. I'm so impressed by what you're doing here. Thank you, President Swallow. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Dana, for everything you're doing to make this event happen. And thank you, Edna. Where did I see Edna? For the wonderful remarks last night. Around 2014, I had the idea to start collecting letters from African Americans to Lincoln. And I'm not sure exactly where I got the idea from, but I wanted to put them together as a book called African American Correspondence and Conversations with Abraham Lincoln. I figured out very quickly that I had too much material for one book, so I decided to get a twofer out of it. And I put 125 letters from African Americans to Lincoln in this book to address you as my friend, African American Correspondence to Abraham Lincoln. And then I gathered the stories of the meetings that people had with Abraham Lincoln into a second book called A House Built by Slaves. And I wanted to show you, these are some of the men who wrote to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War with Lincoln in his desk. And I use the word men on purpose. I have not found images of any of the women who wrote to Lincoln. About 20 women did write to Abraham Lincoln, and then the letters from men might have just a single signature, or there's one that I'll show you in a little bit that actually had 1,000 signatures on it. And what I found was that people wrote to Abraham Lincoln about what was going on in their lives. And for the first time in American history, African Americans saw a president in the White House who they believed might have their interests in mind. And so whereas white people had been writing to the presidents for decades, now during the Civil War, many, many African Americans are going to do this as well. And in doing this, they are claiming the right of citizenship. They are claiming we are citizens. We have a First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances and to go to government leaders when we need to say something or we need to ask for something. Most of these faces are probably unfamiliar to you. Some of them might be familiar. Some of them are famous today. You have Frederick Douglass in the top center. He wrote to Lincoln twice and met with Lincoln 3 times, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. A few of these were ministers. One of them went on to serve in Congress. And this one here, I'll just point out, was an orphan from the 5 Points neighborhood in Manhattan who went on to become a spiritualist and a sex magician. And if you want to know what a sex magician is, you got to get the books. So I wanted to show you 2 letters that came to Lincoln, 2 of the 125 that I included in the book. This is from a man named Hannibal Cox. Hannibal Cox had been born into slavery near Richmond, Virginia before the Civil War, and after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he joined a U.S. colored troop regiment. And as a slave, it was illegal for him to learn how to read and write. In Virginia, it was illegal for enslaved people to become literate or to teach them how to read and write. But as a soldier now in the Union Army, he began to learn how to read and write. And he was so proud of what he was learning that he wanted to tell the President of the United States. And so he wrote this letter, and at the very beginning, he talks about how he had been denied education as a young person. And then the bulk of the letter is actually a poem about the flag of the United States that he copied out of Harper's Weekly. But the most touching part of this letter, to my mind, is this little postscript at the end. And I don't know if you can, they don't teach cursive anymore, but I'm sure everyone in this room was taught cursive when we were in school. And he wrote, "I sends this for you to look at, you must not laugh at it." And I love that sentiment because we as people often have a natural inclination to laugh at someone when they make a silly mistake. And I think that Hannibal Cox feared, well, first, he believed that if he sent this letter to the president would hold it in his hands and read it. And he feared that the president might have a natural inclination to laugh. His spelling and punctuation and grammar and penmanship might not be perfect, and what if Lincoln laughed at this? And so he asks Lincoln not to laugh. And I have to believe that Lincoln did not laugh when he held this letter. And the reason I believe that is Lincoln received between 200 and 300 letters a day. And most of those letters got sent out to different departments of the government, and now they are housed in different record groups at the National Archives, and each record group pertains to a different department of the government. And those letters, whether they came from white or black correspondents, Lincoln almost certainly didn't save and didn't handle. But there were some letters that were kept among Lincoln's private papers that were discovered after his death. These are the letters that I think meant the most to him, and they're now housed with the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. And there are 21 letters from African Americans in Lincoln's papers at the Library of Congress, and Hannibal Cox's is one of them. This is a letter from a woman named Annie Davis, and she was enslaved in the state of Maryland. This letter was discovered 30 years ago by a mentor of Edna's and mine at the University of Maryland. Annie Davis was enslaved in Maryland. She wanted to visit her kin on the Eastern Shore, and her mistress wouldn't allow her to go. And with nowhere else to turn, she writes to the President of the United States to ask, am I free? Am I a free person who can go and visit my relatives? Now, sadly, she wrote this in August of 1864. Maryland was not included in the Emancipation Proclamation, and so she was not yet free. But what Annie Davis didn't know was at the time, Lincoln was working behind the scenes with state authorities in Maryland to try to get Maryland to amend its constitution to forever abolish slavery within its state. And by November 1st, 1864, Annie Davis would be free and free to visit her relatives when she wanted to. Now, as I mentioned, black people didn't just write to the President of the United States, they also went to the White House and met with Lincoln. And it's fitting that we're on a college campus because one of the things we have to understand when we think about the White House in the 19th century is that presidents held office hours in the same way that a college professor does today. I'm often sitting in my office, and if my light is on, students will come in and talk to me about anything they want to, and that's great. That's what I'm paid for. And Lincoln, it was the same thing. If you've seen the Lincoln movie by Spielberg, this gets really wonderfully captured where there's a family from Missouri who comes in and talks to him about a bridge that they're having to deal with. And that's what happened during the Civil War. Americans would line up in the White House. His office was on the second floor, what is now the Lincoln bedroom. They would line the hallways, down the stairs, and they would wait their turn to come in and meet with the president. And for the first year of the war, only white Americans claimed this privilege. But beginning in April of 1862, African Americans claimed this privilege as well. Again, we are citizens. This is our people's house too. This is our president. We have a right to come in and talk with him. Now, one of the earliest visitors to the Lincoln White House, black visitors to the Lincoln White House, was this man here, Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was enslaved in South Carolina. He was working as a pilot in Charleston Harbor on a ship called the Planter, which you see pictured here. Robert Smalls was very concerned about the possibility that his wife and children could be sold away, and that's something Edna talked about last night. And he wanted to get his family out of bondage because this threat was always looming over their family. And he concocted a plan to steal the CSS Planter, take her out of Charleston Harbor, and out to the Union blockading vessels and become free in that way. Now, this was a very dangerous plan because if too many people found out about it in Charleston, then word might get out and he would get caught. Not only that, he had to get past the Confederate guards in Charleston lining the harbor, and then, even if he's made it to that point, he's going to be piloting a Confederate ship to Union vessels, and he has to hope that they won't fire upon him. And so he and a few friends put their plan together. They didn't tell their wives and children what they were doing because they didn't want word to leak. Before dawn on May 13th, 1862, they get their families aboard. It's Robert Smalls and 15 other enslaved African Americans. They take the ship out through the harbor. Smalls was wearing a linen coat and a hat so that he would, in the darkness, would look like a pilot, look like he was supposed to be commanding the ship. He gave the signals to the Confederate guards around Charleston Harbor. He knew what they were because he'd been working on the ship. And in the darkness, they don't realize it's a black man stealing the Planter. He then makes it out to the Union blockading vessels and is able to show them that he is not attacking them. And he turns it over to the Union fleet. And for this daring act, Robert Smalls becomes a hero in the North, and Northern newspapers extol him and praise him for what he's done. This is in May of 1862. In August of 1862, Robert Smalls travels to Washington, D.C., and he delivers a speech at Israel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was pastored by Henry McNeil Turner. 1,200 people came to hear Robert Smalls tell his story. And Turner was very impressed by Smalls, and he called him a living specimen of unquestionable African heroism. Well, while Smalls was in Washington, D.C., he also made a visit to the White House, where he met with Abraham Lincoln. We don't know exactly what Smalls said to Lincoln. Smalls talked about it briefly many years later in 1886. But I have to imagine, if I was Abraham Lincoln and I had this man sitting in my office, I would say, "Can you tell me the story about how you stole the Planter?" That's what I would want to hear about. Now, why does this meeting matter? Up to this point in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had refused to allow black men to serve in the army. And Edna used a quote that I was going to use today as well, where he feared that if he put arms into the hands of black men, that they just might soon be turned over to Confederate soldiers. Lincoln feared that black men would be cowards on the battlefield. But now Lincoln was with a man who had shown his bravery, his willingness to fight for his freedom and for his family's freedom. And I think that this had an impact on Lincoln's thinking about black soldiers. And the evidence is that when Smalls returned to South Carolina later that month, he carried with him a letter from the War Department that authorized the arming of black soldiers. And the 1st and 2nd South Carolina colored volunteers were raised as a result of him having this letter. And so a meeting between Lincoln and an African American had a very real, tangible effect on Union policy. And so within a matter of months, Smalls went from an enslaved boatman to someone who's giving advice to the President of the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued a few months later, January 1st, 1863, and it authorized black men to join the Union Army. But just because black soldiers were now allowed to join the Army does not mean that they received equal treatment. They expected to enlist and be paid $13 a month. as white soldiers were. But instead, they were paid as laborers, and so they only received $10 a month, and laborers had an additional $3 deducted from their pay. So they enlist expecting $13 a month, and instead they're receiving only about $7 a month. And not only that, the Confederate government had declared that black men who were captured in arms on the battlefield would be treated as slaves in insurrection and would either be executed or sold into slavery, even if they had been born free. Now, many of the letters that Lincoln received from black soldiers and their families dealt with these issues of unequal pay and Confederate atrocities. But Frederick Douglass actually decided to press Lincoln in person. Douglass, as many of you know, had been born into slavery in Maryland before the Civil War, had escaped to the North, and he decided to travel back through Maryland for the first time since escaping in August of 1863. He showed up at the White House uninvited. Lincoln didn't know to expect him. And he didn't know, Douglass didn't know, whether he would be received or turned away. But when he got to see Lincoln in Lincoln's White House office, Lincoln took him by the hand, led him through the room, and they sat down together to talk. And Douglass pushed Lincoln on these issues of unequal pay and Confederate atrocities. Douglass had been working as a recruiter, and 2 of his sons had enlisted in the Union Army, and he was very angry about how black soldiers were being discriminated against in these ways. After all, Confederate bullets did not discriminate based on the color of your skin. Now, on the issue of unequal pay, Lincoln said that eventually black soldiers would get equal pay, but it couldn't happen right now. Politically, there would be too much resistance in the North, and Lincoln said many of the black soldiers are coming right out of slavery. They should consider some sort of monetary value in becoming free and becoming a soldier. And on the issue of Confederate atrocities, Lincoln said that if he could punish someone who had actually committed a war crime, he would do it, but he didn't want to punish soldiers, Confederate POWs, who had not committed a war crime. Now, as you might imagine, Frederick Douglass was not altogether satisfied with these answers from the president. But he went away from this meeting struck by 2 things. First, he was struck by the fact that Lincoln did not treat him differently on account of the color of his skin. And he also came to understand in a different way the political pressures and realities that Lincoln was facing. A few months later, in December of 1863, Douglass gave a speech, and he talked about meeting Lincoln. He said, "I have been to Washington to see the president, and as you were not there, perhaps you may like to know how the president of the United States received a black man at the White House." Douglass then said, "Lincoln received me just as you have seen one gentleman receive another." And then to thunderous applause and laughter, Douglass said, "I felt big there." Now, so far I've told you about 2 very famous people who met Lincoln. Smalls was famous at the time, went on to actually serve in Congress for 10 years. Douglass was famous at the time, and I think is probably the most famous African American of the 19th century. But Lincoln met with people who are not as well known as well. This is Alexander Thomas Augusta. Augusta was born free in Norfolk, Virginia, about 30 minutes away from where I live, in 1825. His family moved to Baltimore in the early 1830s. My hunch is it was after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Virginia authorities really clamped down on free and enslaved African Americans, and I think his family decided to get out of Virginia. He became a barber in Baltimore, but he really wanted to become a doctor. And so he applied to the University of Pennsylvania Medical School in Philadelphia and was denied admission on account of the color of his skin. So Augusta moved to Toronto, where he attended Trinity Medical School, became a medical doctor, and then went on to teach other young black men how to become physicians. And he practiced medicine for about 6 years. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and 6 days later, Augusta sent this letter to Lincoln. He described how he wanted to be a doctor and had to travel to Canada to actually become a physician. But now he said he wanted to return to the United States at the top of the right page to be of some use to my race. And so he asked for an invitation to travel to Washington, D.C. to be examined and become an Army surgeon. Well, the War Department invited him. He traveled to Washington at great expense. When he got before the examining board, they said he appears to be a person of African descent. And they wrote to the War Department and Secretary of War and asked the Secretary of War to rescind Augusta's invitation. And to his credit, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, said, "No, you must examine him." At that point, the examining surgeon, a man named Cronin, put Augusta through the hardest examination he could come up with. Cronin called it a squeezing process. And Augusta passed with flying colors. Afterwards, the Surgeon General went to Dr. Cronin and said, "I say, Cronin, how is it that you came to let the N-word pass?" And Cronin replied, "The truth is, sir, the N-word knew more than I did, and I couldn't help myself." So Augusta is commissioned a major in the Union Army, and he is the highest-ranking black soldier of the Civil War era. But just because he's now an officer in the Army does not mean he will no longer face discrimination. At one point in May of 1863, he's traveling through Baltimore and a white mob attacks him, rips off his shoulder straps, which are the signal of his rank, punch him in the face and give him a bloody nose. On another occasion in February of 1864, he's supposed to travel through Washington, D.C. to get to a military trial to testify as a witness. And the conductor will not allow him in the streetcar, says if you want to ride, you need to sit on the outside with the driver. And Augusta refused to face that indignity. And he took these two moments to the press. They made national news. They were debated on the floor of the Senate. And one Democratic newspaper very snidely remarked that if this black surgeon was so upset about the way he was being treated, he should take it up with his commander-in-chief. Now, I don't think Augusta saw that article because it was actually published in Indiana, but that's exactly what Alexander Augusta did. On February 27, 1864, he and another black surgeon, Anderson Abbott, decided to go to the White House for a reception. The President and First Lady regularly had evening receptions on Tuesday evenings, and anyone who wanted to in Washington could go to these receptions. To this point, only white people had gone. But Augusta and Abbott decided we are soldiers, we are officers, we are citizens, we have a right to do this as well. And so they put on their uniforms, they put on their winter wraps, and they walked to the White House. As they approached the White House, they were very nervous. They could hear the music wafting out of the building. We know about what was going on in this scene because Abbott wrote an account of it that he kept in his papers, and we published actually in the Lincoln Forum Bulletin last year. So you can read Abbott's account. Abbott described how they showed up at the White House door, they took off their winter wraps, handed them to a servant, and got in the line to meet the president. When Lincoln saw these two black men, Lincoln eagerly approached them, and eagerly is the word that Abbott used. He went up to Augusta and shook his hand. At that, Mary Lincoln looked over and saw this, and she did not like what she saw. And she sent her son Robert over, and Robert went to his father and said, "Are you really going to allow this innovation?" And the president turned back to Robert and said, "Why not?" And at that, Robert slinked back to his mother. Lincoln turned back to Augusta and shook his hand again, and then turned to Abbott and shook his hand. And then the two black doctors walked through the beautiful East Room of the White House. And Augusta said they tried to pretend like they were enjoying the music and looking at the paintings on the wall, but that you can imagine how high their adrenaline was running in that moment. And Augusta said that as they passed through the East Room, the crowd of white guests just opened up in a hollow circle around them. And you can imagine the eyes looking at these two men, some with wonder, some with amazement, some with dismay, some with anger. Lincoln's private secretary, William Stoddard, was there. And he called it a practical assertion of Negro citizenship for which few were prepared. And then he said, to watch this scene was as good as a play. Now, these two men made an implicit claim of citizenship, but some black visitors to the White House made explicit claims for the rights of citizenship. About a week later, on March 3rd, 1864, two black men from Louisiana brought a petition signed by 1,000 people calling for the right to vote for free-born, light-skinned, educated, wealthy, tax-paying African Americans in Louisiana. There was a Creole population that had African, English, Spanish, French ancestry. And these were wealthy people, very light-skinned, but people of color. 28 of the signatories were actually veterans of the War of 1812 who had served with Andrew Jackson. And their claim was, we pay taxes, we are educated, we should have the right to vote. And they presented this petition to Lincoln in his White House office, and Lincoln sat down with these two men, and he said to them essentially that he agreed they should have the right to vote, but that as president, he didn't have authority over the right to vote. And so if they could come up with a way of justifying it as a war measure, then it would be something that he could support. Well, these two men went away, and they thought about it, and 7 days later, they wrote out a new petition. And I can't prove this for sure, but I'm pretty certain that they returned to the White House on March 12th and gave this new petition to Lincoln. And in this new petition, they changed their justification and their ask. Initially, they had asked for the right to vote for light-skinned, wealthy, educated, freeborn black men. Now they called for the right to vote for all black men, whether born in slavery or in freedom. And they said that enfranchising black men would, and this is their words, give full effect to all the Union feeling in the rebel states in order to secure the permanence of the free institutions and loyal governments now organized therein. What were they saying? Well, at some point, the Union will be restored, and during Reconstruction, there will be many, many white men who have been traitors to the Union who will eventually get the right to vote again. And if you want to counteract them, if you want to preserve Republican, small r Republican government, the best way to do that is to enfranchise the loyal population of the South. Give black men the right to vote to counteract the traitors who have been fighting against the Union. And Lincoln was persuaded by this, and the very next day he sent a letter to the governor of Louisiana privately making a recommendation. I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in, that is, into the franchise, as, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. They would probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty within the family of freedom. In other words, you want this government to survive, you want the jewel of liberty to survive, bring black men into the body politic. A month later, in April of 1864, another group of African Americans came to the White House to call for the right to vote. They were led by Abraham Galloway, who had been born into slavery in North Carolina before the Civil War. And they brought a petition with them making the claim, and they pointed out, black men had voted in North Carolina from 1776 until 1835. And they said there had never been any problems when black men voted during that time. We are loyal to the Union. We are serving in the Union Army. We should have this right to vote. Again, Lincoln showed sympathy for them. But again, he said, I don't have control over the right to vote. This has to happen as North Carolina is reconstructed. There were 6 men in this delegation, some of whom had been born free, some of whom had been born into slavery. What struck them the most was that they were welcomed in through the front door of the White House, that they shook Lincoln's hand, and that he showed sympathy for their cause. One of them said that if they ever dared to go to the front door of the lowest magistrate judge in Craven County, North Carolina, he said, we would be told to go around to the back door because that is the place for the N-words. But he said, when we approached Lincoln, he treated us as if we were the ambassadors of Japan. That same month, in April of 1864, a woman named Caroline Johnson came to the White House. She was an artist in Philadelphia. She made beautiful displays of wax fruit. And she wanted to make a display to give to the President and First Lady to show gratitude for what he had been doing during the Civil War. And so she made a wax fruit display. It cost her $150 to make, and it had a retail value of $350. And that's an extraordinary amount of money in 1864. I don't have a picture of Caroline Johnson, but I can show you the room she was in. It was the White House Library, which is the Oval Room on the 2nd floor overlooking the Washington Monument. She arrived at the White House on April 2nd, which was a Saturday. And this is important, I think, because Lincoln generally greeted visitors on Tuesdays and Fridays, so he's now meeting with her on an off day for meeting with strangers. But what's even more important is the space that they met in. The library was part of the private living space of the first family. This was where Lincoln would take naps. He would put his feet up. He would look out the window at the unfinished Washington Monument and at the Confederate state of Virginia across the Potomac River. This was where his children would sometimes play with their friends, or where he would read the Bible in the morning before the day began. This was not a public space. And as far as I can tell, this is the first time that African Americans were welcomed into this room, into the private living space of the first family, other than those who were there as servants or slaves. And so Lincoln met with Caroline Johnson and her Black Baptist minister, Reverend James Hamilton. And Hamilton spoke first, and he made a few remarks about the wondrous change that had happened during the Civil War and his hope for the future. And then he turned to Caroline Johnson and he said, perhaps Mrs. Johnson would like to say a few words. Now, Caroline Johnson was naturally nervous in this moment. Here she is standing in the White House with the President and First Lady. She looked down at her feet, not knowing what to say. But then she said she felt as if the Holy Spirit was burning inside of her chest. And her mind went to the Old Testament prophet of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 51, where God promises everlasting comfort and salvation for the suffering. And in Isaiah 51, the prophet says, listen to me, you who pursue righteousness. Look to the rock from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham, your father. And with these words in her mind, Caroline Johnson said, Mr. President, I believe God has hewn you out of a rock for this great and mighty purpose. Many have been led away by bribes of gold, of silver, of presents, but you have stood firm because God was with you, and if you are faithful to the end, he will be with you. Lincoln was visibly moved by these remarks, and he responded with a few emotional words of his own. He thanked her for the beautiful present that he had given him. He talked about the difficulties he was facing as president, and he attributed, and these are his words, the wondrous changes of the past 3 years to the ruling of an all-wise providence. And choking back tears, Lincoln said, you must not give me the praise. It belongs to God. Lincoln met with Douglass later that year in August of 1864. This time, Douglass came to the White House at the president's invitation. The war was going very badly for the Union in the summer of 1864. Lincoln was renominated to be president for the Republican Party in June of 1864, but Ulysses S. Grant was stuck outside of Petersburg, Virginia, and he had just lost 60,000 casualties in a period of about 4 weeks, and William Tecumseh Sherman was stuck outside of Atlanta. And Lincoln was surveying the military situation, and he had become convinced that he would lose in his bid for re-election. And so in August of 1864, he calls Frederick Douglass to come to the White House to have a meeting. And they begin by talking a little bit about political developments going on around the country at this point in the war. And then Lincoln turns to him and he says, Douglass, I hate slavery as much as you do, and I want to see it abolished altogether. And Lincoln explained that the problem was he had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but not enough enslaved people were taking advantage of it and running to Union lines. And what Lincoln was worried about was that he would lose the election in November and be out of office in March of 1865, and that the Democrat who beat him, it would most likely be George McClellan, although he had not yet gotten the nomination, that the Democrat who beat him would rescind the Emancipation Proclamation, and the opportunity for freedom would be gone. And so these two men sat down together to concoct a plan where they would send, and Douglass then later wrote this plan out in a letter to Lincoln, and he said, we will send bands of scouts into the Confederacy, essentially shouting from the rooftops, run away now while you still can, because once Lincoln is out of office, your golden opportunity will be gone. Now, fortunately, things took a turn for the better for the Union Army. Sherman captured Atlanta in early September 1864. Lincoln sailed to re-election, and nothing had to come of this plan. But this was an incredible moment. When we usually think about Lincoln and emancipation, we think of emancipation as a military necessity. That's what Lincoln called it. We think about it as a means for winning the war, for saving the Union, for not having that much of a moral component to it. But if freeing the slaves in this way at this time had nothing to do with military necessity, it had nothing to do with saving the Union, it had nothing to do with winning the war. It had everything to do with making freedom as widespread and as permanent as possible. In short, Lincoln was pushing for emancipation with Douglass in this way, not to win the war, but because it was the morally right thing to do. And this meeting had a profound impact on how Frederick Douglass viewed Lincoln. Douglass later said, "What he said to me on this day showed a deeper moral conviction against slavery than I had ever seen before in anything spoken or written by him. I listened with the deepest interest and the profoundest satisfaction." Now, these are just a handful of the meetings that Lincoln had with African Americans. And the thing that was interesting to me as I uncovered some of these meetings, like with Douglass, are well known. Others have been mostly forgotten over the last 150 years. The thing that struck me in every meeting but one, and Patrick asked me about this one exception before I came on, so I figured I would save it in case you wanted to bring it up during the Q&A. In every meeting but one, Lincoln treated his black visitors with the utmost respect and cordiality and kindness, always shaking their hands and listening respectfully in every meeting but one. Lincoln also did that as he traveled around Washington, D.C. And I want to just close with, he met with Sojourner Truth. For the sake of time, I'll leave this one out. But I want to close with just two stories about his travels around Washington, D.C. Because the way that he treated black visitors at the White House was the same way that he treated African Americans that he met around the city. In May of 1862, he visited an Army hospital in Washington, D.C., and this was something that Lincoln would do to go and shake the hands of soldiers and to thank them for their service. And he was shaking the hands of convalescing white Union soldiers, and an Army nurse saw him and introduced him to 3 black cooks who were working at this Army hospital. And these were people who had run away from bondage in Kentucky and were now refugees in Washington, D.C. And he shook each of their hands and greeted them by name. "How do you do, Lucy? How do you do, Garner? How do you do, Brown?" And what Lincoln didn't see in that moment, but the nurse saw, was that the white convalescing soldiers were behind him, cursing him, using the N-word to describe these cooks. They were furious that Lincoln would treat them with respect. Throughout the second half of the war, when Lincoln would travel between the White House and the soldiers' home in Northwest D.C., he would occasionally stop at the contraband camp, which was near where Howard University is today. And when Lincoln would go there, he would often hear these black refugees sing. And one of the first times he showed up at the contraband camp, the commander of the camp went to a young black woman named Mary Dines, and he asked her to sing for the president and first lady. And Mary said her knees trembled, and she said, as she stumbled in front of the people and began to sing, "Nobody knows what trouble I see but Jesus." She later recalled, and this is what she said, "The thought of singing before the president nearly killed me." And she sang the first verse by herself, constantly looking over at Lincoln. And then on the second verse, the other black refugees joined in. And she said that she saw the president and first lady the president wiping tears away from his eyes. She said that eventually the black refugees kind of forgot that the president was there, and they began, these are her words again, began to shout and yell, but he didn't laugh at them. And you can see in that moment that the black religious experience was going to be very different from Lincoln's Presbyterian experience at New York Avenue Presbyterian and Church. And her first thought was the same thought that Hannibal Cox had in his letter to Lincoln. Will Lincoln laugh at this? But Mary Dines said that not only did Lincoln not laugh, but he joined in the singing. They all sang John Brown's Body together, with Lincoln belting out, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his soul goes marching on." And Mary said, "He had a sweet voice, and it sounded so sad when he tried to follow her in the first tune." I think that a very important relationship developed, and the reason I wanted to show you this picture is that if you look closely, you can see that these black refugees are holding songbooks, and the caption for this photo is that these are the contrabands preparing to sing for the president, as he's going to show up later in the day. A very, I think, special relationship developed between Abraham Lincoln and African Americans during the Civil War, something that had not existed before between Black Americans and a U.S. president. And it's little wonder that when Lincoln was assassinated on April 15, 1865, Black Americans mourned with greater earnestness than white Americans did. One Black veteran said this: "Our faith was almost staggered. That faith which had sustained us in so many battles was now staggering under a blow which was severer than any battles, the death of our immortal leader." And the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, said that on the day Lincoln died, he saw, and these are his words, "several hundred colored people, mostly women and children, weeping and wailing their loss." This crowd did not appear to diminish throughout the whole cold of that wet day, and they seemed not to know what to do, what their fate was to be, since their great benefactor was dead. And their hopeless grief affected me more than almost anything else. Those strong and brave men wept when I met them. And what I hope to do in these two books is to recapture this relationship that developed between African Americans and Lincoln, and tell the stories in their voices as much as possible. So thank you so much for having me, and if we have time for questions, I'd love to take them. And there's going to be a mic, there's a mic going around.
Yeah, we always have time for questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Sure.
Wonderful talk. So let's open it up. Rich is right there, ready to go.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
You know, you talked a lot about how Lincoln felt during this whole time period. Could you describe how his wife felt? Okay, because obviously there are private conversations that happened between he and his wife behind closed doors. And was she supportive of his views, or did she have a different take on it?
Yeah, I think, and this is a matter of some contention among Lincoln scholars, whenever you bring up Mary, you're going to get fireworks. So I'll try to tread lightly. My view is that Mary was not as supportive as Lincoln was of the presence of African Americans in the White House. So on the one hand, she grew to become very close to her seamstress, a woman named Elizabeth Keckley, who had been born into slavery in Virginia and then eventually became free and was a seamstress for Verena Howell Davis before the war and then for Mary Lincoln during the war. When Lincoln died, in fact, there were only two women who were with Mary Lincoln consoling her in the weeks following the death. And one of them was Elizabeth Keckley, and the other was the wife of the black valet at the White House, William Slade's wife, Josephine. And those were the two women who were spending time with her. So on the one hand, she grew very close to these two black women. On the other hand, Mary was a woman who had been raised in Kentucky and raised surrounded by slavery, and I think did not like the thought of black people being treated in any way as equals in the White House. And so the example I would give, and it's interesting, I mean, there are aspects, it's not a perfect, I can't give you a perfect answer because there are inconsistencies in how Mary acted. I mean, she welcomes Caroline Johnson into the White House for the presentation of the fruit, and then it loves the fruit so much that evening, or a few evenings later, there was a reception, and she brought in the Commissioner of Public Buildings and said, "Look at this, I love this is beautiful." And on another occasion, she had tea there were black men who came to push for black military recruitment in New York, and Abraham and Mary Lincoln had tea with them in the Blue Room. And so on the one hand, she does those things. Prior to New Year's Day, 1865, an advertisement went out in the Republican paper in Washington saying that anyone who wanted to would be welcomed at the White House for the New Year's reception to come in and shake the hand of the president. And hundreds of African Americans get dressed up and get in line along with white people, who are dressed up and in line, and they're going to go in and meet with the president. And the first few black women make it through the line and shake hands with the president and first lady, and Mary Lincoln says no more, and orders the marshal and orders the guards, don't let any more black people in until the white people have gone through. And a number of the black people then leave, but many wait, and then by the time they get in, Mary goes upstairs and Lincoln still shakes their hands. So I think that story from January 2nd, 1865 captures what I think was probably her view of, and then the Alexander Augusta scene as well, of her view of African Americans coming into the White House in these social functions. Yeah. Hey, Dave.
Morning, John. I think we all know the story of Lincoln visiting Richmond with his son Tad, but it seems like there was very little good reporting as to the interaction that day, what was said to him and what he may have said back. Have you found good sources for some of that?
I think there's actually great reporting on that scene of April 4th and 5th, 1865, where Lincoln and Tad go to Richmond, and if you go now, you can walk the path that they did, and then behind the Tredegar Iron Works, there's a statue of Lincoln and Tad sitting there that was installed, I think, around 2004. So Lincoln is back in Richmond now. What's interesting about that moment is that the white population of Richmond tended to stay away, and the black population of Richmond came out and crowded around Lincoln, and outside of the state capitol, and it was also the Confederate capital, Lincoln delivered a speech to them, to the black crowd that had gathered around him, talking about what freedom would mean. And there are several accounts that survive of that speech, and the accounts generally they use different words because it was just people writing down what they heard Lincoln say, but the accounts generally track the same themes. So I think we have pretty reliable sense of what Lincoln said. There are some things that people wonder if they might be apocryphal. David Dixon Porter had an account later of a black man kneeling down and Lincoln saying, "Don't bow down to me, only praise God." And, that may or may not have happened. That recollection was written many years later. And as with all, I don't remember what I did 2 days ago, so I don't know how people remembered what Lincoln said verbatim, 30 years later. So Lincoln may or may not have said that. But I will say, it's in keeping with what Lincoln said to other black people who came to the White House and thanked him for emancipation. When Caroline Johnson came and thanked him and gave this gift, he said, "Don't give praise to me, it belongs to God." So whether or not Lincoln said that to the black man in Richmond, that is in keeping with what we know he said to a number of other black visitors.
I just had a comment about Lincoln's attitude. I can appreciate your comments, I really do, and it reflects Lincoln's compassion, and that was hallmark, I think, of his personality, his compassion. And as I understand it, he saw or took the position that the blacks, the colored at that time, were certainly worthy and entitled to economic equality. But I understand that he stopped at that point and really did not view them as socially equal. Would you agree with that?
I think that Lincoln's views change over time. And so I think if you look at the 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas, he says he has no problem with white people being superior. He said if there's going to be inequality in some ways socially, he has no problem with white people having the superior position. I do think that interacting with African Americans during the Civil War does begin to change his views on certain things. I think that black visitors to the White House were able to persuade him of certain positions. So, for instance, the right to vote. In the 1830s, Whigs actually played the race card on the black suffrage issue, because in 1821, Martin Van Buren had advocated for broader suffrage for African Americans in New York than they had. Black men needed to own a good deal of property to vote in New York, unlike white voters. And Martin Van Buren had advocated for a broader suffrage. And when Van Buren ran for president in the 1830s, Lincoln went out there using that to bludgeon the Democrats over. Oh, your candidate wants to allow black men to vote. And Lincoln, for the bulk of his adult life, does not support black voting rights. In the last year of his life, he changes. And he, as I said, after meeting with these delegations, he met with at least 3 delegations of black men who pushed him on the right to vote. I told you about 2 of them, and there may have been more. These meetings changed his view. He began working behind the scenes with Louisiana as Louisiana is being reconstructed into the Union, trying to persuade them at the state level, change your voter qualifications. And he finally comes out publicly in April 11th, 1865, calling for limited black suffrage. And that's a remarkable thing in 2 ways. One way positive, one way negative. It's positive because it's the first time in American history that a sitting president calls for the right to vote for black men. It's remarkable in a negative way because he calls for the right to vote for black men who are educated or have served in the army, and there's no restrictions on white voting in that way. So he was actually a little retrograde in that way of appealing for black suffrage. But you weren't going to have any president calling for black suffrage prior to 1864 or 65, and certainly not Lincoln. He wouldn't have. So I think there was a change in his thinking over time. And again, I attribute a lot of it to the interactions he had with the black community of Washington, D.C., where they are advocating for their rights. And he's a president who's willing to listen.
Time for one more.
In the way, or here, yeah.
How do you view his children, surviving children, and their views on the racial question in years after he was assassinated?
Oh, it's an interesting question. He had 4 boys, but only 1 survived to adulthood. And so the example I would give, and Harold and Edna would be much more qualified to talk about this than I am, is that Robert Lincoln was at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in 1922, and African Americans were segregated. It had to sit in a different part during the ceremonies, and Dr. Moten, who delivered the address, his address was censored when he was very gently pushing for equality. And I don't know that did Robert say anything about this? I don't think. And the Pullman strike too. So yeah, I'm not sure that, I'm not an expert on Robert Lincoln, especially I live in the 19th century. I don't follow into the 20th century. So I'm not really the person to answer that. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out.
Patrick, just one last question.
Yeah.
I know this is your first visit to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
That qualifies you to be a Packer fan if you would like.
See, I didn't wear my Phillies hat because I thought I'd get in trouble with the Brewers and the Phillies being so close right now.
That's right. Let's take 5. We got 5 minutes here. Refresh your coffee and whatever else. And we'll be back for our next speaker.